welcome everyone to what I think is our second ThinkIn in the newsroom this year. I'm Alexi Mostris, I'm an editor and partner at Tortoise, and it's great to see everyone in the room and online as well. If you haven't been to a ThinkIn before, it's modelled loosely on a newsroom conference, a newspaper conference, so the idea is that despite the brilliance of our panel guests, we also want to hear from you. We want to hear your points of view. So if you have anything to say on the subject of eugenics, then write it into the chat if you're listening online, or raise your hand or catch my eye if you're in the room, and I'll try and bring you into the conversation. And hopefully by the end of the hour, we will have reached kind of a more sophisticated and a better understanding of a complex and knotty topic. And you can't really get more of a complex and a knotty topic than eugenics. But luckily, we have got a brilliant guest to help guide us through it. Adam Rutherford is a scientist, a writer, a broadcaster, one of the best science commentators, I would say, around today, through programs like Radio 4's Inside Science, Curious Case of Rutherford and Fry. He lectures at UCL. He teaches eugenics there and the history of eugenics. And he's now written a great book called Control, The Dark History and Troubling Present of Eugenics. And I read it over the weekend. And one of the things that was really, really striking to me was that this book, which is at least partly historical, was so relevant for how we think about the big issues today, and also how we're going to think about the big issues going forward as well, in terms of genetic manipulation and the big questions like what it means to be human. But before we get into that, Adam, welcome. I thought initially when I was sort of sketching out what I was going to say at the beginning of this, that I would try and define eugenics for the audience, but I had like quite a lot of difficulty in even kind of defining it, because I kind of know what it means, but I don't know how much of it, how much state control is implicit in the definition of it. So can you just kind of take us back to basics and define eugenics for us? Yeah,
I mean, it's really interesting that you introduce state control right there up front, because I think one of the things that I argue in the book is that the idea that populations can be manipulated or controlled or shaped according to the wishes of the ruling power is an eternal thing. It's existed in every society as far back as the Western canon goes. But eugenics is a sort of scientification of that idea that comes about in the mid to late 19th century in the wake of the theory of evolution, so Darwinian thinking about how animals can be are not immutable and they can change over time, and we're animals, and so therefore this should be applied to humans, as we have done with agriculture for the last 10,000 years. But the question of how much of it is top-down rather than giving reproductive autonomy to individuals is, as you say, it's difficult to pinpoint where exactly that boundary lies. I think, from my point of view, what's interesting is that, because I'm a scientist and I'm interested in genetics and the history of genetics and evolution, right, is that it's a long-standing idea which emulsifies in the landscape, in the sort of cultural landscape of Victorian Britain and in other countries as well. But it's effectively the marshalling of a scientific idea into an existing political ideology, right? And I think, from my point of view, and I write a lot about that as a sort of concept, because my earlier work about the history of race science is also about the invention of aspects of science which persist to this day, which are marshaled or are co-opted into supporting a pre-existing political ideology.
So your book is called Dark History and Troubling Present, and it kind of divides into the history of eugenics and also some of the present applications of it. You actually start, though, with an example involving the first gene-edited humans. So you start with a present-day example. And they're called Lula and Nana. And I might get this wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong in this description, but a Chinese scientist attempted to introduce a genetic mutation into these two human embryos, who went on to be born. And he was trying to grant them immunity from HIV infection. Now, it's interesting that you should start with that example, because in that example, there was no top-down state intervention. There was no mandatory element to it. So can you just talk about that example and how it fits in with your idea of eugenics?
Well, in a couple of ways, really, because the first is that the idea that we can impose rule or biological control over unruly biology is really central to the whole eugenics movement from the 19th century onwards, but also all the way back through history. You know, it dates all the way back to Plato, suggesting that particular qualities of people could be quantified and therefore they should be mated together in order to maintain the societal structures of the hegemonic power. And that's a perpetual theme. It's a perpetual theme all the way through Western history, all histories, in fact, not just Western, and then into the Victorian era where it becomes, as I said, scientified. But it continues after eugenics becomes this sort of irredeemably toxic idea that we regard it today as. But one of the things that happens in the post-Second World War era is that the eugenics laboratories and records offices, which are fundamentally interested in studying human heredity, you know, how traits are passed from generation to generation, they evolve and they mutate into human genetics departments. And there's a distinction there because the human genetics departments are fundamentally scientific establishments, whereas the eugenics departments were fundamentally scientific establishments in a political ideology. So there's that distinction. So the invention of reproductive technologies like IVF, like embryo selection, like gene editing, which all came out of, in some cases, the actual same labs that were eugenics offices, 20 or 30 years earlier, are inventing these techniques which are primarily for scientific knowledge, meaning, a deeper understanding of how humans work and our evolutionary trajectory and disease and medicine, but also in order to alleviate human suffering for particular diseases. And so what then happens, and the reason why Lulu and Nana and the story of He Jiankui, I think, is an important starting point, is that we've now got the technology and the reproductive technology to actually do the things that the eugenicists would have been so keen to do 100 years ago. We can now do that. We have lots of legislation and moral frameworks which prevent that. Nevertheless, it did happen in the case of He Jiankui and those two baby girls. So I don't know whether that is eugenics. In fact, I'm quite explicit that I don't think it is. But it is the same in principle that it is the manipulation of human reproductive autonomy in order to direct a particular group of people in one direction rather than a sort of natural framework that is the result of having babies the traditional way.
Because in that example, what struck me about it was that a lot of what is problematic about eugenics, at least in a kind of traditional sense, is this idea that you can kind of grade humans, that some humans are better than others. Whereas this example seemed, at least on the face of it, to be about alleviating a potential suffering. And so how important is that distinction in terms of how you think about eugenics?
Well, what was it, though? Because the intention was to give a prophylaxis to two children for HIV infection, which their father, we believe, was HIV positive. So he's not treating a disease there. I describe it in the book as a sort of a lifelong condom for a disease that most people avoid anyway. So it actually qualifies not as a therapeutic intervention, but as human experimentation, right? So he wasn't attempting to treat a disease. He wasn't attempting to alleviate suffering in those individuals, although I suppose you could argue that that was his broader intention. Fundamentally, he was trying to adapt them to be able to live a different lifestyle. From the one that they might have had to have done if without that intervention. So this is enabled by the new technology. The morality of it is, for people to discuss. Although I think there aren't many people that would defend those actions.
Let's talk a bit about the origins of eugenics, because what was absolutely shocking about this book is that you would not believe the number of notable, impressive, genre-defining people, be it like Churchill or Mary Stopes or D.H. Lawrence, who liked and in some cases actively supported eugenics. But just track the idea from Plato all the way up to Francis Galston for us. In one answer.
Yeah, well, in one sentence. Well, like I said, I think the earliest solid records of the idea of that becomes eugenics, it comes from Republic, so Plato, books 5 and 6. But of course, his utopian city-state never existed. So other examples might be the Spartans, the much venerated Spartans for their militaristic might, and they become interesting characters in the book for other reasons, which we might get onto. But in the film 300, which is not a documentary, we see...
It's an important historical record.
Exactly, yeah. We see the first winnowing event that happens according to how the Spartans are written up, which is only by Plutarch, and that's several hundred years later, so we don't actually know whether it happened or not, but it's babies with deformities or are cast aside, thrown off Mount Tegetos into the apothetai, the deposit, or left out. They're exposed, left out to survive, and if they survive this first hurdle, they can become part of Spartan society. Now, we don't know whether that happened or not. We do know from Seneca, a few hundred years later, that infanticide was a part of Roman culture. And then there's other bits and pieces of evidence from the classical world which pretty much clearly indicate that infanticide is sort of almost universal in cultures in the ancient world as a means of effectively selecting against what is perceived as weakness, so disabilities and deformities fundamentally.
Is there any, obviously it's completely abhorrent and probably ineffective, but is there any evidence that sort of stuff works?
No. No. For complex reasons. Well, yes, you are going to remove deformities and disabilities from if you kill the children that have it, but that's not going to remove them necessarily from occurring in subsequent generations. There's always, perpetually, from Plato onwards and into the present era, there is a comparison between this agricultural, model. If we can shape cows to have big milky udders, then why can't we shape humans to have traits that we find interesting or desirable?
And I think Richard Dawkins made exactly that comparison.
He did a couple of years ago on Twitter, maybe last year on Twitter, where he sometimes says things. And I thought that was an interesting... He said something like, why wouldn't eugenics work for us? It works for roses, it works for pigs and cattle. We are biological entities, and therefore why wouldn't it work for us? And I thought, when he tweeted that, I thought, initially you go, oh God, he said something again. And then I thought, actually, that is quite an interesting question, because it seems... I think he started that tweet by saying, of course it would work for us. And it was that, of course, that really got me thinking, is that right? Is it correct, so self-evidently correct that you can say, of course? Because I don't think I thought about it as hard as I then did in order to write the book. I think I probably thought, yeah, of course it would, because we are biological entities. Yeah. Right? We are Darwinian. We have genes. We can be moulded and shaped across generations. And then I thought, I sort of ploughed into the idea, would eugenics actually work for us? And for complex reasons, which we can talk about, I've come to the conclusion that the answer is not a bluff, of course, but actually not really. So the agricultural metaphor I don't think really works. I did something which I don't think most people who've written about eugenics for the last 3,000 years have done, which is I asked a shepherd what the process was like. I actually, engaged with farmers.
You did some reporting.
I did some reporting. I phoned up the only shepherd I know, James Rebanks, who you might know, heard he's an amazing writer, and said, what do you help me out with this? What's it like breeding sheep? And we had, lengthy conversations in which he pointed out a number of things which are kind of self-evident and they're kind of obvious when someone points them out to you, which is, well, the first thing is you can breed for individual traits in animals on farms so that you can get meatier lambs or milkier cows or whatever it is. But they often come with consequences which are unforeseen because we don't really understand how genetics works. So, Frisians often come with problems with mastitis, and certain lambs get born to have much meatier legs, so they have more value in the market, but they can't give birth, right? And then there are more complicated, more nuanced things like some sheep don't do well in the fields or in the mountains, and so have to live in the environment of they can only give birth inside the confines of the farm. And that actually becomes a really important theme for agriculture in general. You're not selecting for animals to be generally healthier. You certainly don't want animals to be more intelligent necessarily. Those animals on farms that we farm and eat exist in the confines of those farms. They're bred to exist in this particular context. So I guess, yes, you could breed humans to live in very, very specific contexts. But it comes with unforeseen consequences, so disease risk or other mutations that we cannot predict. With our current knowledge of genetics, we cannot predict if you select for one thing, whether you're deselecting something else or selecting other things. So for example, people with high IQ, there's an association, a correlation between high IQ and anorexia or ADHD or a whole bunch of other stuff. So if we start saying, can we legitimately select for higher IQ, which is a dubious question in and of itself, are you also selecting for all sorts of terrible things that you don't really want your children to have? And the answer to that is, I don't know, right? And I think what's important is that, this is just going to sound arrogant, but if I don't know, then I feel like people who aren't professional geneticists aren't going to have a clearer idea. And yet, there are plenty of people out there, including politicians and journalists, who seem to have a much clearer understanding of human genetics than my colleagues. And that bugs me a little bit.
Like Dominic Cummings.
Well, Dominic Cummings is an interesting example because I think he's what I describe in the book as a sort of science cosplayer. So he's fascinated by science and has spent quite a lot of time trying to engage with science and some really meaty ideas in science, many of which are to do with genetics and the heritability of things like intelligence. And on his, I don't know, you guys are journalists, and so you probably have read some of his voluminous blogs, which are very, very long and very, very impenetrable. But I have to say, I think he's made a decent fist as someone who hasn't spent the last 25 years being a professional geneticist, has made a decent fist of trying to understand some pretty complex science. But at the same time, I think has absolutely wedded himself to stopping at the point where I think his political ideologies are met. And that is the opposite of science. That is being ideological. So, I mean, again, you start by asking me, well, why are we talking about this now? Why is it the troubling present? It's to do with conversations like that with our new understanding of genetics, of polygenic scoring, of complex traits, of CRISPR gene editing, of like the Chinese babies. These are the same issues that are coming up again in biology, and also it's the same attempt to marshal science into a political ideology. That's my argument anyway.
So I really want to bring in some people who have been making comments in the chat. If we could go in a second to Joshua Kearney, and then to Andrew Brown, and then to Keaton Jar, then that would be great. But Adam, I just wanted to ask you about this relationship between eugenics in the past and the sort of conversations that Dominic Cummings and other policymakers might be having now. And you say in your book, it's got an interesting quote from you, I think it's in your voice, saying racism, sexism and classism are inherently built into attempts to make people fitter, happier and more productive. It seems to imply that kind of racism, sexism or classism is inherently built into the idea of eugenics.
Yeah, I mean, you missed the Radiohead quote then, didn't you, when you said that? That's a line from a Radiohead song.
You know what, I did miss it.
Anyone else get that?
To my shame.
I do like to litter my text with. It's just to entertain myself more than anything else. Yeah, I think that is true. I think that there's a sense in which the most basic concept of eugenics is something that we all are, which is that the word itself, that Francis Galton coined in 1883, basically means it's you meaning good in Greek, and genics meaning sort of born or genesis, and so it means well born. And in its purest sense, it is the idea that we want our children and our kin and our compatriots to live good lives. And who doesn't want that? Who wants their children to be born into suffering? So in that sense, we're all eugenicists. But the problem is that in order to make those sorts of decisions and impose them upon societies, there comes a point very rapidly where you have to say that we want to enhance qualities at the top end of society, right? We want people to be fitter, happier, more fitter, happier, cleverer. I've now forgotten the Radiohead. More productive, thank you. Yeah. But if you're going to rank people, and if you're going to impose quality sanctions on people, then it is impossible not to, at least at a minimum, admit that there are people at the other end of that spectrum who are going to be deselected.
But what is the relationship between that and the idea that you can select in order to mitigate against hereditary conditions or particular illnesses? Because a lot of people would say that we should be using all our tools to try and increase the better life and decrease the possibility of suffering in those cases. Still don't quite understand the relationship between the two.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, I mean, we know how to do that. We know how to do that through social mechanisms already. So better education, equal opportunities, better access to healthcare, to food, to exercise, all those things which are socially mediated things that are demonstrably improve the quality of people in populations. And so when the eugenics movement begins in the late 19th century, and again when we're having the same conversation with people like Dominic Cummings to a certain extent, where we're talking about using science that is really poorly understood in the 1900s, is much better understood today, but is still really, really, like superficially understood as far as professional geneticists are concerned. The question immediately becomes, well, why are we looking to things that we don't really understand to improve society rather than to do the things that we can, that we already know work, right? But that is the story of science and politics. So one of the things I've said in all of my work, which other scientists sometimes get riled about, is that all science is political. The notion that science is amoral and apolitical is an impossible dream. It's a noble ambition, but it cannot ever be achieved because science is done by people, right? So, trying to the invention of the discoveries the great discoveries of science, like Darwin in the 1850s and many of the other revelations of the 19th century, and then into the early 20th centuries about evolution and genetics and the rediscovery of Mendel's laws and all that stuff that people like me absolutely love. Watching it or discovering it or writing about it being marshaled into political ideologies that were normalized at the time, that were supported by people across political divides, it's troublesome, right? It's bothersome. And I think that what we see is that history recapitulates every generation. The new technologies enabled the same questions to be asked, but with more sophistication. But they are the same questions.
Let's come to Josh in a second, but just on those new technologies, what is the thing that is going on at the moment that most troubles you, that is, in your opinion, closest to the eugenics of the 19th century and early 20th century?
Well, I mean, there's two ways to answer that. The first is that the enforced sterilisation, mostly of women, has not stopped, right? So that's not a 21st century technology. That is ongoing. The most recent cases of involuntary sterilisation or sterilisation without the knowledge or consent of women in America was last year, right, in the ICE detention centres. There is an ongoing class action in Canada, in Saskatchewan, of dozens, if not hundreds, of women about their involuntary sterilisation over the years from 2012 onwards. In India, long-term or permanent sterilisation of women of reproductive age is the most common form of contraception. In China, there's allegations, which I think are credible, about effective sterilisation programs for the Uyghur people. So, examples of actual what look a lot like eugenics policies of the past are contemporary, happen in the world today. During the pandemic, during the second wave of the pandemic, DNR notices, do not resuscitate notices, were reported to be put on the beds of people with disabilities, including people with Down syndrome, in this country, right? The numbers are not at the scale that we talk about through history, but that's the same idea. So the ideas of eugenics and the practice of eugenics has not ended. The toxicity of it that where we changed our views about eugenics that resulted in that came from the revelations of the Holocaust, they have waned, but they haven't gone away.
Okay,
Cool. Oh, I was just going to say, but there are the new technologies that are different from the old versions. I think it's the conversations rather than the practice about the possibility of, for example, shaping, selecting people for higher intelligence, using new techniques in genetics, which I think are the most. They're the ones that trouble me the most. Not necessarily because they're things that will happen, because I actually take the view and argue in the book that they're practically impossible, or practically, their effects will be negligible. But it is the same, it's the recapitulation again of people saying, well, we can do this, so we should do it, and that those sorts of conversations, and at least until just before the pandemic, were happening in Downing Street.
Okay, let's bring in Joshua, if we can. Joshua, are you around? Hi.
Hi, yeah.
Thanks for waiting.
That's what, thank you.
What do you want to say?
I posed a question in the chat, which you've spoken a little bit about, but I was just wondering, I'm a neuroscientist myself, and I'm kind of wrestling with this question of whether science is just simply subject to political intervention and manipulation, such as the examples of eugenics and racism, or if there's something about science itself that is political, which I think you kind of spoken about. Because I do think it's really important. I find it really admirable that you sit there as a scientist and say, I don't know. And my experience is that's not a particularly common thing or something that comes easy to us. There's an expectation that as a scientist, we hold a certain type of truth that is informative in a kind of authoritative way to conversations. And so I'm wondering if there's something about science that makes it subject to political ideologies.
And just before we turn to Adam to answer that, what do you think? Do you think that they're intrinsically linked?
I just muted myself. I think perhaps it holds, at the moment I'm still wrestling with it, but I think perhaps it probably holds an unfair privilege as a way of knowing compared to other ways of knowing. So I think the problems probably stem from its status. I think it's an incredibly valuable and exciting thing, science, but we hold it up as absolute truth when I don't think it is.
That's really interesting.
That's a great question. And there's a lot to unpick there. I mean, that's a history of science and philosophy degree you've just described there. So I think that I like the way, Joshua, you use the phrase to describe science as a way of knowing, which I think is how I think about science. And that there are other ways of knowing which are not scientific in their, or not necessarily evidence-based, or rely on the scientific methodologies that we've designed in the last 300 or 400 years. I do think it is the best way of knowing. But I think that the notion that scientists hold truth is a misnomer that many people in the public, many non-scientists, think is true, when actually what we do is we tend towards an ever-moving target of what truth actually is. And I think we've seen this so spectacularly in the last 2 years that I can't work out whether science has had a good pandemic or a bad one, on the grounds that the reliance on the science, when there is no the science, but the authority of science was relied on so much during the last 2 years, but subsequently gets challenged because the science has moved on, or the data has moved on, and therefore the decisions that were correct 2 days ago are no longer correct, or that the decisions made 3 weeks ago were not correct and were not based on the evidence as we had it, as we knew it at that time. So I think that fundamentally the problem is not so much that it's what I think is a misunderstanding of what science is by people outside of science, such that we don't really teach about probability or risk or the fact that all science is conditional and transitional. And so an over-reliance on what the data says, I think, it sets ourselves up for failure, right? You know, we say, well, the science is the authority here, and then it turns out to change, and then people turn around and say, well, the science is bollocks.
And that relationship between science and politics is something you see a lot in the last two years, and it also reminded me to ask you about two quotes that were in the book that I thought touched on this issue of how far science itself was to blame for eugenics, or at least how people see science. So you've got Churchill saying eugenics depends on facts, and you've got Hitler saying science cannot lie, and they're two are quite kind of similar viewpoints in the sense that they're just saying, okay, let's just follow the numbers. I mean, how far do you think this view of the world where you kind of separate yourself from individual examples and look at numbers and probabilities and graphs is kind of necessary to a eugenics viewpoint?
Well, you know, Josh sort of set this up in his question by saying, you know, I don't know should be the three most important words that a scientist can say. But that isn't saying I don't know as in I haven't got a clue what's going on here. It's I don't know what the answer to this question is, but I've got a whole like methodology and tool shed full of stuff that should enable me to answer this question because it's a scientific one and I can base it in evidence and using the methods that have been tried and tested because they're evidence-based. So there is an authority in the methodology there, which I think is important. But you know, throughout history, politicians have turned to science to give their ideologies a stamp of scientific authority, which is outside of, which is perceived or they think is outside of the sort of grubby world of temporary politics or opinions. And that's what race was. That's what the invention of race was. It was, you know, there's a phrase that Emma Dabiri uses, which I think is very good, which is that race was invented to justify racism, to serve racism. And that, I think, is fundamentally true. The creation of racial taxonomies in the 17th and 18th century by Western scientists was not in parallel with European expansion and colonialism. It was in service of it. And in exactly the same way, well, evolutionary theory was not that. That was independently developed as a scientific idea. But what Francis Galton did was immediately say, well, I see a piece of biology here which is interesting and robust and applies to humans, and therefore we should use that we should, you know, weld it to our political ideologies of what turned out to be, you know, white supremacist ideas, to be scientific racist ideas, and eventually ableism, misogyny, and things. You know, the initial idea, which is we want to improve people, we want to improve the stock of the British people, turns into deeply illiberal ideas, and possibly can never not be.
And I think you also use the example, don't you, in Nazi Germany, or just before that regime came to power, where eugenicists in Germany actually recommended that more breeding should take place between Jewish and non-Jewish people.
Yeah.
But then they switched that around when the Nazis came to power to kind of be consistent with the ideology of the Nazis.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, so the key protagonist in the development of eugenics in the Second Reich and Weimar Republic Germany is a chap called Alfred Plutz, and he, interesting fella, started off as a socialist, went to work on a collective farm in Iowa, but was so unimpressed by what he regarded as, he describes as just bad people, that he came back and committed the rest of his life to eugenics and developing and supporting ideas of eugenics for the purification of the Nordic people in Germany. But he was the one who first suggested that the Jewish people are so successful in intellectual pursuits that the Nordic people would do better to breed with them. But, as you say, Hitler's virulent anti-Semitism, and as he takes power in 1933, a lot of the eugenicists who previously had been not anti-Semitic, just figured that the best way that they could get their ideas about eugenics and Nordic purity enacted was by signing up to the anti-Semitism of Nazism.
Just going to come to Seb in a second, but I just wanted to ask you, when you were researching this book, did you kind of get a little bit depressed about how these great scientific heroes of yours, Galston, Fisher, to name two, but there are lots more, were able to be so brilliant scientifically on the one hand, but were, you know, racists and unable to see the flaws in their eugenics theories as they were developing them? I mean, why were they blind?
Well, you know, as a sciencey type person who writes about history, then my formal answer is no, I'm just really reading the texts and sourcing the evidence. The actual answer as a human being is, yeah, it's fucking miserable. Yeah. You know, it's an awful process writing this, incredibly depressing. And also, you know, I had the same feeling when writing the book about race. Slavery was bad, right? That this is not a controversial thing to say. And then when you go to the primary sources, it's so much worse than you thought it was. And the same with you know, the Third Reich is probably the most studied part of modern history, certainly in the West. And then when you go to the primary sources, it's so much worse than you could possibly imagine. And you know, the key actions, so many historians and many people will know about things like, you know, the Nuremberg laws, which were the eugenics and subsequently the euthanasia laws that the Nazis had, and Action T4, which was effectively the euthanasia policy that was backdated to the beginning of the war in 1939. The reasons these things get imposed, the reason that backdating happened, you know, involve individual stories, which are, well, at the end of many days, I would close my laptop and sit there in silence and go and look at cat videos on the internet, or take my dog for a walk.
It's always a help. Seb.
Thank you. Yeah, this is making me think a lot about, the whole discussion is making me think about social media and the way that, like, the person that I find beautiful and eventually, like, you know, probably want to be in a relationship with, and then, you know, who knows, one day, you know, all that. I mean, the degree to which that's defined by beauty standards from Instagram and social media sites, and, you know, like the kind of person that is beautiful and worth kind of reproducing with, I guess. And it's making me think about that and how that's been one very specific looking person for a long time, and then more recently it looks like a lot more different people. And then and you know how that's defining, and you know, you feel like your view of what beauty is and attraction like changing with the times of social media and this introduction of a wider kind of, you know, more varied looking people. And then it's making me think of dating sites, and you know, maybe dating sites go in the way that TikTok goes with social media, where like one day you'll just get your phone, you'll open it, and you'll be like, you're going on a date with this person. And the degree to which, like, you know, dating sites are defining kind of the future of relationships and reproduction, I guess. And, you know, at what point, like, it's making me think, at what point could you say, like, tech companies are doing eugenics? You know, like, by defining, like, who's dating who and who's reproducing with who. And, like, I mean, you know, it's maybe, it's just a thought, you know, you don't have to take it, but yeah, it's a thought.
No, it's an amazing thought. I mean, you know, Facebook's already ruined democracy, Twitter's already destroyed public discourse, so why not? They should embrace eugenics as well. I think that's a very interesting question, because I want to answer it in a slightly, approach it from a slightly different angle, because one of the things that is persistent throughout the eugenics movement as perceived in the West, so I really only focus on the enactment of eugenics in America and Germany, and we didn't ever have eugenics policies in this country, even though they mostly were invented here. So, I mean, it's a crude analogy, but it's a bit like, you know, the way we invented cricket and then turned out to be rubbish at it. That doesn't really work, does it? It's not funny, huh? What was I saying? Oh yeah, right, so the veneration of classical civilization, I mentioned the Spartans at the beginning, is a persistent theme throughout the whole history of sort of population control as designed by the West. So you see it in specific and abstract ways. Madison Grant wrote a book in 1916, which was cited by Hitler in Mein Kampf, which is called The Passing of the Great Race. And it's also mentioned sort of from a sideways point of view in The Great Gatsby. So the ideas about population replacement theory are persistent. Madison Grant talks, it's a nuts book, totally nuts, and really, really, it's sort of impressively racist. He asserts that the great civilizations of Greece, Rome, and Egypt were seeded by tall, blonde Nordic people who came down from northern Germany and Scandinavia, started off these populations and then retreated back to their forest dwellings. And so, ancient Greece and ancient Rome and Egypt were actually Nordic people, right? Now, that's nuts, right? You don't have to be a classical historian or a geneticist to recognize that that's bonkers. And yet, there it is as part of the sort of central thesis. Now, that's a sort of weird and obtuse one. At exactly the same time, you've got this cadre of people in the 19th and early 20th century who follow a very clear pattern of education. So they're all middle or upper class people. They all go to one of the 7 public schools and then to Oxbridge, where they all read classics and maths, right? They've all read Gibbon. I think, actually, they've only actually read the title of Gibbon. And so there's this great perception, which is universal amongst the eugenicists and persists in our political classes today, that the greatest civilizations that ever existed were Rome and Greece, and Rome fell. And why did it fall? Because the decadent upper classes were not having enough children, and the enemies were at the gate, mostly from the East. And that is the sort of encapsulated Wikipedia version of the fall of Rome. I think, most classical historians today regard that as an incredibly sophomoric, very superficial analysis of a changing demographic in an empire. But it's absolutely central to the generation of eugenics as policy in the 19th century. Galton cites it, R.A. Fisher cites it, Churchill cites it, Balfour cites it. Hitler cites it in a slightly different way. Obviously, he doesn't have that same educational background. But it is the absolute veneration for Hitler of the Spartans. And he describes them as the first racialized state, right? And their policies are admirable. Sorry, it's turning into a lecture. It's a weird thing about the Spartans is because they lost, right? They lost that battle, the Battle of Thermopylae at the Hot Gates. But it's the same idea that they're the invaders from the east, led by Xerxes, but they stood up. You know what happened to the Spartans after they lost that? 200 years later, they ended up as a circus troupe. Why the hell do we venerate these people who advocated militaristic might, infanticide, and ended up as a circus troupe? Some of the Brexiteers in the last couple of years call themselves Spartans. I mean, which era of Sparta are they talking about? I think it might be the circus era.
Let's bring in, if we could...
Sorry.
No, it was good. It was good. Nikki Gorb, if we could. She is around. Because I think that there are so many ways to talk about this subject, Nikki, and Adam covers a lot of them in his book. But you raised a specific question about genetic work with children with muscular dystrophy, and I know that Adam has spoken a bit about some kind of out-and-out eugenics policies that are still in place today, and forced sterilisation. But I think that and they're obviously to be condemned. But I think the knotty part of the debate right now is to what extent we can use genetic manipulation to alleviate suffering. So do you just want to expand on your point, or to make your point to Adam?
Yeah, just as far as I understand it, I think children with some genetic disorders are taking genes from a third embryo or sperm to ensure that the child is born without the genetic mutation to then go on to have a severe disorder like muscular dystrophy. I think that's already being done, and I think children have been born in this country with that genetic modification. I just want to...
And are you quite optimistic about the future in terms of how these sort of techniques can be used to alleviate suffering, or are you concerned?
No, I think. I mean, I work with children's hospitals, and I see children born with severe disabilities who die very young or has severe disabilities that have huge implications for the costs, the suffering. We've talked about that in the chat. Luke talks a lot about suffering, the parental burden, the care, the, the there is suffering to these children who can't swallow, can't talk, can't move. I mean, it's about what is life, I suppose. How, when we live, how do we want to live? And I suppose if we can have some genetic modifications that enable children to have a good quality of life, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, as Adam was saying, who doesn't want to have a healthy child in life? So anyway, it's my thought that in carefully controlled and with strong controls, this is a good thing.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think that is, I think I sort of slightly alluded to this at the beginning, but that is the sort of significant difference between the principles of eugenics in the pre-war era and what emerged from those same labs and from those same bits of science, which is for treatment and for the alleviation of suffering in individuals. You're talking specifically about gene therapy, but also it sits hand in hand with embryo selection, that if you go through, if women and parents go through the process of IVF, and there are known diseases that run in those families, then they have, at least in the West, in the wealthy West, we have the option of selecting embryos that are free from those diseases. And I think that if that technology is available, then the question it changes from being, should we do this, to why shouldn't we do this?
What line do you have to cross when that shift occurs?
Yeah, I don't know, right? I mean, that is a great question, but the ethics that come, the bioethics and the regulation, mostly by the HFEA in this country, that come with those sorts of decisions are incredibly well formulated, and they're well formulated with long-standing statutes and guides like the Helsinki Declaration and things that have emerged from our discoveries of what happened during the Holocaust. And incidentally, those are the same rules that were violated by He Jiankui in China in the birth of Lulu and Nana, because those are deemed as experimentation rather than therapeutics.
But I just wonder on the Lulu and Nana thing, it made me wonder whether, you know, the real condemnation of that case came because the experiment failed, or because what he was trying to do wasn't so, was, as you said, it was more of a prophylactic than curing something that was definitely causing suffering. And I just wonder whether if he had done what he did, but had done it successfully and had successfully prevented two embryos from going on to develop a really life-changing disease, whether public opinion, whether your opinion would have been different.
I think it would have been slightly different, but not hugely. So if it had been successful, well, let's just deal with the fact that it wasn't, by his own admission, by his own data, the edits that he tried to perform on those two embryos failed. And so in re-implanting them into their mother, and then the mother taking them to term, he had effectively gene-edited two children and introduced a mutation that was unknown to either science or nature. Right? So that's why it qualifies as experimentation. And it's not therapeutic in the sense that it's attempting to deal with an existing condition. It's, as I say, you know, a prophylaxis. Now, if he had succeeded at that, I think that that does take some of the negative, a proportion of the negativity in the analysis of that case away, because, you know, if you'd failed to do the thing that you'd set out to do, then you wouldn't have proceeded. I don't think it should have got to that stage in the first place. So I think that yeah, there is some alleviation, but it still remains not therapeutic, experimental. We still don't know what the consequences of that particular mutation, of introducing it, are to the health of those children. Maybe it will prevent them from developing HIV. We've got no idea what else. What other consequences they might endure as a result. Do you know what? I suspect probably not much. Right? In all honesty, I suspect that those children are probably going to be fine. But we don't know. And one of the things I say in the book is, you know, you can't afford to be careless like that. You know, scientists can't afford to be careless when mucking around with human lives, and no one can be. When there are tried and tested ways for producing healthy babies without the need for those sorts of interventions.
Okay, I want to bring in Julie Bush in a second, if I could, because I think that she works with kids that have these sort of conditions. But I just, I mean, Adam, what are you thinking in terms of looking forward? Because CRISPR, which you mentioned before, this new technology that, as I understand it, allows much more precise and easy manipulation of genetic code, is going to get better, and it's going to get even cheaper, and the technology might kind of develop exponentially. So in 10 years' time, you may be able to do a lot of what you can't do today. So how does regulation need to shift in order for us to be able to kind of harness that in a responsible way?
Well, I actually think the regulation is fine in this country and in Europe more broadly as it stands. It's a slightly different situation in America where there isn't regulation. There isn't legislation to prevent selection for traits rather than selection for diseases.
At embryo level.
At an embryo level, yeah.
So it just explain like how that would work in practice.
So from the 1980s onwards, we have been able, during the IVF cycle, to select embryos so that we don't select ones that have specific diseases that are relatively easily identifiable. So things like Huntington's disease and muscular dystrophy and cystic fibrosis and other diseases that run through families. The first cases, the first children born, which I think was 1980, done by Robert Winston at the Hammersmith Hospital, were embryos selected who were girls rather than boys because they knew that they were looking at two diseases that ran through families but only affected boys. Right? So that's the first embryo selection for a particular disease. Now, nowadays, we have a much more sophisticated understanding of complex traits and complex diseases. And what we mean by that is it's not just one disease that affects that, it's not just one gene that affects that disease or trait, but it's many, dozens, sometimes hundreds, in some cases thousands. And we now have the capability to look at embryos or look at any cell that we could take from you or anyone here and work out your sort of risk score, it's called a polygenic risk score, for any particular trait or any particular disease. Now we can apply the same idea now to embryo selection for diseases and say, well, the risk of this embryo rather than this one is higher for diabetes or schizophrenia or something like that. And that is very, very heavily regulated, except in the United States, where there is much less regulation.
So you can, in the US, you can select an embryo on any basis?
Well, in theory, yes. So the first child born who had been selected for polygenic diseases was a couple of years ago, and is probably one or two now. As far as we're aware, as far as I'm aware, no children have been born having been selected for traits, but that is not illegal in the States, whereas it is in the rest of the world. So it potentially could happen. Now, on the one hand, you might think, well, if we can do that, then why shouldn't we? There are multiple reasons, which I'll do very briefly. The first is that, if you take something like intelligence, which is highly heritable, has a large genetic component to it, and we've got a pretty good understanding of some of the genetic architecture that underlies cognitive success. When it comes to the practicalities of actually doing this during an IVF cycle, if a woman has, 8 eggs as part of that cycle, then the best modeling, the best calculations that we can make in terms of the increase by embryo selection for that number of embryos, if you chose the one with the highest probability of scoring highly on an IQ test, you're talking about an increase in IQ of about 1 or 2 points. Right? So IQ, the error margins of IQ are 5. So you can increase your IQ in a test if you drink a cup of coffee, right, before you take the test. So it's negligible at best. If you do the same modeling for height, you're talking about an inch, which, if you wear lifts in your shoes, you can achieve. So it's kind of a fantasy that people like Dominic Cummings and Toby Young and other people in the States and other people who are, sort of science fanboys are talking about really seriously we should be doing this at the population level. You also forget that IVF's horrible. I mean, it's not a nice procedure. It's painful, it's expensive, it takes time. No one enjoys that. The people who, when Cummings or Toby Young or people talk about that, they're not the ones who have to endure, intrauterine injections or stimulation of their ovaries to release eggs. So it's a fantasy. You know, it's practical fantasy. The gains are almost non-existent.
And what about if you look beyond embryo selection 20 years, 30 years in the future, and you say, okay, well, could you inject some, you know, additional genetic material in order to achieve a result?
Well, I think that is a good question, and it's a different question, because I think we're getting to the stage with developmental genetics and developmental biology where we may be able to actually create eggs at a much greater numbers, so we wouldn't be limited by the amount of eggs that a woman can release during hyperstimulation of her ovaries. Now, we're not there yet, but that is the type of direction that reproductive biology is going in, and that is a different question, and I mean, I suspect that me and you are going to be sitting here in 10 years' time having a similar conversation. But it's the same thing again. It's you know, will technology enable us to impose rule over unruly biology? And maybe we inch closer to the eugenic dreams of Galton with this new technology, but I think the same issues still stand.
I think I didn't introduce our digital tortoise over on the left, but when she reaches the end of the screen, I think that means that time is up. But I think we've got a couple more minutes until we hit 7:30. So let me just bring in Julie Bush, if Julie is around, because I think, Julie, you might have an interesting perspective on this. Do you want to make your point?
No, I was just saying I have in the past worked with profoundly disabled children and adults, and my point was just that there's no easy answers to anything. I don't know what the answers to anything are. You know, those children have as much validity and agency and as you or me, and the idea of what is a good human, or what are we trying to achieve by being better humans, is, you know, who knows the answer to that question. I've also worked in orphanages in Romania where the children who were disabled or non-verbal or had deformities were taken away from orphanages and sent to what was called the House of Irrecuperables, which were, you know, even worse places than the orphanages. I mean, they were terrible places. But those children that I worked with, some who were completely non-verbal, could not move from the neck down, I had amazing relationships with. They're incredible people. And I would imagine their parents would say that their validity and their love for them were just as much as anybody else's. But then for those children to be looked after is an enormous cost, financial cost. There's a million questions, none of which I know the answer to. That was my point.
I think that's probably a good way to, and a good message to end this thinking on. Adam, I mean, there's so much still to talk about, and I really do recommend that anyone that wants to kind of look into this more closely reads Adam's book, because it's kind of accessible whilst at the same time being kind of comprehensive. But if you had to leave us with one message from this book, what would it be?
It's a good question. I think it would be, we've been talking a little bit about the reliance or the over-reliance of politicians and people outside of science on science as a crutch to support their ideologies. And I think maybe, it's a quote from Darwin, from The Descent of Man, but it is this, which I think is a phrase in 1871 that rings true absolutely today, which is that ignorance more often begets confidence than does knowledge. And that feels like it could be and should be a metaphor for our time.
Well, that's good. Thank you so much. I can't really end better than that. Thank you so much for everyone that tuned in online, everyone that's in the room today. It's been a really, really fascinating discussion. And thank you, Adam, very much for coming along. See you later.